Hey everyone, it's Andrew here at our educational center at Rancilio Group North America. Today we're going to be looking at elevating your home espresso experience. If you're not familiar with Rancilio, we are a commercial espresso machine company primarily. We do have a couple of home machines. So we have the Sylvia and then we have the Sylvia Pro, which is this espresso machine right here. So it has double boilers and then a PID on each boiler. And we'll be using this for the video today. So when we talk about home espresso, and if we compare that to espresso on bar, this is a little bit of a different brew method. And we're gonna dig into why that is and how we can approach home espresso with a different set of tools so that we can reduce waste and get the best taste experience for the espresso. So let's first start talking about good brewing practices. One of the biggest differences between brewing at home and brewing on bar, if you're a barista and you've worked on bar before, one of the biggest differences is going to be temperature stability of your espresso machine. A commercial espresso machine on bar is usually a lot more accurate and has been sitting idle for a long time. So it has fully heated. You don't typically have to worry about heating the machine up and the temperature discrepancies that you get there. With a home espresso machine, a lot of times you are turning it on and you're heating it up from cold. So one of the biggest things that you can do to make sure that you have a good, stable temperature environment is to wait 30 minutes after starting after turning on your espresso machine. Think of this as like the preheat the oven part of the baking recipe. So for a home espresso machine, you're going to want to wait about 30 minutes so that all of the components of the espresso machine reach a thermal equilibrium. With the Sylvia Pro, it's actually very accurate with the temperature stability. It can compete with even really high-end commercial espresso machines. And it only really takes about 15 minutes to be able to get good brewing temperature. But if you want the most accurate brewing consistency, even for this machine, you'll want to wait 30 minutes to get the most out of the espresso machine. So aside from temperature stability, a few things to really focus on. You want to make sure that the espresso machine is clean. So doing a daily water back flush, I think, is a good idea. Before you turn it off, just use your back flush disc or your basket to send some water through the group, kind of clean the machine. I would recommend using detergent weekly if you're using the espresso machine every day. And this will make sure that you are setting yourself up for a really good brewing environment. And lastly, when we talk about good brewing practices, you'll want to make sure that you use filtered water for your espresso machine. Water hardness is also important, so you want to make sure that you aren't using water that's too hard. There's a lot of options on the market for softening your water, and there's even water softeners you can add to the tank of your espresso machine. But if you aren't sure of your water hardness, you can look up what your city water quality report says about the water hardness to get a general idea of what the hardness in your area might be. But just make sure that you're using filtered water as a minimum there. So after we established good brewing practices, one of the best things that you can do to improve your home espresso experience is with good puck prep. So if you're used to brewing on bar as a barista, your puck prep may be super quick. You're just doing the same thing as everybody else on bars so that everybody's brewing espresso the same way. When you're brewing at home, you can take a little bit more time with your puck prep and make sure that you're avoiding extraction channels. And if you're not familiar, extraction channels are where water is bypassing the espresso puck. And you can kind of tell when that's happening with a spouted portafilter. You may see a lighter stream of espresso kind of coming out quicker on one side versus the other. So those kind of color discrepancies can reveal if there is an extraction channel. If you have a bottomless portafilter, which is just a portafilter with the bottom removed here, you can see the basket and see a little bit more clearly if there is an extraction channel. So to have good puck prep, we first want to make sure that we're using the right tools. So your tamper should match the basket size of your portafilter. So this is a 58 millimeter tamper. The Sylvia Pro has a 58 millimeter basket. You can get more specific. Some baskets are rated to the 10th of a millimeter. But for our purposes here, we're just going to stick to the basics. Just make sure that you have the right millimeter for your basket. So 58. Some espresso machines are 54 millimeters. Just make sure that when you have the tamper in the basket, that there's not a ton of wiggle room. There shouldn't be really more than like a millimeter of room. It should definitely be less than that. So after making sure you have the right tools, another thing we want to do is make sure that we know the size of our basket. The Sylvia Pro comes stock with a 14 to 16 gram basket. There's also 18 gram baskets, there's 22, 24 gram baskets. The big thing to note here is how much your basket can hold before you touch the screen of your espresso machine, because we want to avoid overfilling the basket and touching the screen. And it's very easy to check. You can, grind, tamp your shot, purge and then wipe the screen of your espresso machine, and then just add the portafilter with the espresso to the espresso machine, and then remove it and see if you see an indentation of the screen. We want there to be a little bit of space so that the water dispersion from the screen can soak the puck evenly. So after we're making sure that we have the right dose size, when we are preparing the espresso before we tamp, just make sure that you are taking your time and giving the espresso a good environment. What I like to do is, after I dose my espresso, I like to settle, and then I use my finger to make sure that the top of the puck is even before I tamp it. Some people don't like to touch the top. You can actually get a very even surface just by settling if you practice. But this is a technique that I like to use, and I find that it avoids extraction channels. There are a lot of distribution tools. I don't think that you need them to make great espresso, but if you're using them and you're finding that you're avoiding extraction channels, then definitely keep doing that. All right, so we've talked about good brewing practices and good puck prep. Now let's talk about recipe. So this is where home espresso is a little bit different than brewing espresso on bar. And this is where we will start to get into some of the tools that you can use while brewing espresso at home that you don't necessarily use on bar. And this is kind of why I think of home espresso as a different brew method. We're looking for a little bit different of a result. When you're brewing espresso on bar as a barista, you're looking for consistency. You are dialing in a recipe so that everybody that pulls a shot can produce the same extraction, so that you're producing the same quality all throughout the day. When you're brewing at home, if you approach espresso with that same set of values in mind, you're going to purge through a lot of coffee. You can still achieve that. You can find a really tight recipe that you replicate every single day with a tight dose in and dose out and time window, but you will likely end up running through a lot of coffee to achieve that recipe. So with this video, we're going to look at how you can still achieve a really good balance for the espresso without running through a lot of coffee. So that's kind of the goal that we're looking for, is a good balanced extraction without a lot of coffee waste. So we first do need to start with a recipe. My recipe is 16 grams in and 36 grams out, and my time window is 24 to 28 seconds. So that's the recipe that I'm looking for. Your recipe can vary based on what you want for the coffee and also what type of coffee that you're using. This is just the recipe that I find works for me. It's a good starting point for really any espresso from the coffees that I typically drink. But you can apply these principles from this video to any coffee recipe. All right, so after we have established our recipe for the espresso, we're going to talk about this principle of maintaining minimums. This is going to help us make sure that the espresso gets the amount of water that it needs for the extraction and also the amount of contact time that it needs for a good espresso extraction. And again, this is my recipe. Your recipe, you may have different minimums. But because my window of time is 24 to 28 seconds, my minimum time is 24 seconds. So I'm not going to stop the espresso even if it's flowing really fast before 24 seconds. And my minimum yield is 36 grams. So even if my time is a minute, I'm not going to stop my shot until I hit that 36 gram minimum. And this is also going to help inform how much of a flow rate adjustment I need to make on the grinder. The grinder is definitely the best place to make these flow rate adjustments, but we are going to first start by making these grinder adjustments and then move on to utilize other tools so that we don't have to purge the grinder as much. And I've been talking a lot about grams. I really do think a gram scale is one of the best tools that you can use besides a tamper for your espresso machine. It's a lot more accurate than volumetric measurements. You can use a gram scale for baking. It's great for a lot of other things besides coffee. So if you don't have a gram scale, I think that's a great investment. And definitely for this video, we'll be referencing grams instead of ounces or milliliters. Okay, we've established our minimums for the recipe. So let's talk about making that flow rate adjustment. So if you've maintained those minimums and you have seen the minimum time or the minimum yield, the part of the recipe that's not within your parameters, that's going to tell you how much of a grind size adjustment to make. So if your minimum time is 24 seconds and your outdose is 60 grams, then you know you need to make your grind size finer by a pretty good amount, because we're trying to decrease that flow rate by about half. And again, if your outdose minimum is 36 grams and you've hit that, but your time is like 45 seconds, it's a pretty significant change. So you're going to make your grind particle size coarser by probably a few notches, depending on the type of grinder that you have. So after you've made that grind size adjustment, every grinder, almost every single grinder, needs to run through a couple doses before it's actually operating at that grind size, which means you're brewing at the grind size that it's set at. So you're going to need to run through a couple doses. Typically, if you're a barista on bar and you need to make an adjustment, that amount of coffee is typically just purged. Those 2 doses are just purged and dumped. But we want to avoid that because that's good coffee. It's probably coffee that you paid a lot of money for. It's probably really high quality coffee. And so we want to utilize that and make a good extraction. So one of the best things that you can do to control the flow rate of those in-between shots is to updose or downdose. So when we talked about earlier, knowing the dose size of your basket, that still applies here. When we updose or downdose, we want to make sure that we're not overfilling the basket because we don't want the espresso puck to touch the screen. So keeping that principle in mind, you can updose, and that will not only slow the flow rate through the puck down because there's more espresso that the water is moving through, it's also going to allow us to extend out our recipe. So we're now hitting a larger outdose for our minimum. So we're going to be able to still make a tasty extraction, but it's just going to be a flow rate that's more in line with the coffee that we're seeing right there. Similarly, if you need to make the flow rate faster, you can dose down your espresso dose, and that will also decrease the amount of yield you're looking for. So keeping that recipe in mind, mine is 2.2. That's just the yield divided by the dose. 16 grams in, 36 grams out. So if I move up to 18 grams, now I'm looking for 40 grams out. And if I move down from there, then that also shortens the amount of yield that I'm looking for. So this is a tool that you can utilize, keeping your recipe the same to keep from dumping or wasting any coffee unnecessarily. You can also change your tamping pressure. Now this is something that's, along with the dose change, is kind of seen as a no-no on bar. This is something that isn't recommended because you want everybody to be tamping the same on bar. But brewing at home, you don't need to follow that principle because you're not setting up your home espresso machine to be pulling shots throughout the day to serve paying customers. You're just brewing this for yourself. So you can tamp harder, you can tamp lighter to change the flow rate so that you're hitting that parameter window that you've set that works for the espresso that you like to drink and the coffee. So the goal is to never really need to dump or purge or waste any coffee, because if we're following our minimums, then we are going to have a good extraction, even if it's with more water than we're used to or a longer brewing time than we're used to. We're still giving the coffee the right amount of contact time to get a good extraction, and we're giving the coffee enough water to get a good extraction. And if you fall outside of that window, if you put too much water through the espresso, you can use that for Americano. There's no need to really dump that. And if it's too long of a contact time, you could just use that as a base for a cappuccino or a milk alternative based drink as well. And lastly, one of the most important things you can do is write down what you're doing. As you're kind of pulling shots day to day, you're going to see some flow rate fluctuations. And especially if you make an adjustment and you haven't purged for it, maybe the next time you pull a shot, you'll actually be working at that new grind particle size. And so you'll need to know, okay, I don't need to updose anymore because it's been a couple shots, I'm operating at this new grind. I can go back to my original recipe because my flow rate is going to be on par with what I want to see for the espresso recipe. So definitely write down the adjustments that you make so you can see what flow rate to expect. And again, as that flow rate has fluctuation, make sure you keep those minimums, maintain your minimums, because that's going to allow you to have a good extraction for the espresso, even if the recipe is not in line with your ideal recipe. that amount of fluctuation is also going to be able to inform how much of an adjustment you need to make for the next shot so that you are in line with your parameters. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions about anything you've seen on the video, feel free to reach out on Instagram at rancilio.usa. Follow at Rancilio_official for all things Rancilio. You can find out more about the Sylvia Pro if you go to sylviaprousa.com, or you can check out our main website, ranciliogroup.com, and learn about all of our espresso machines there. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to send us a message and stay tuned for more videos.
You